Welcome to the Docketing Excellence Webinar Series.
Welcome to the Docketing Excellence Webinar Series, which is sponsored by Black Hills IP and the SLW Institute. Black Hills IP is an accurate, efficient, and cost-effective U.S.-based IP docketing and paralegal service provider. The SLW Institute is an educational group created by the Schwegman Lundberg Wissner firm, which aims to provide insightful and useful information to the IP community. For this webinar series, we have pooled together docketing experts and managers from the Schwegman firm, Black Hills IP, and their respective clients and customers to help educate on key docketing challenges and issues and share best practices on how to overcome them. The Docketing Excellence webinar series is free. To listen to one of our many past webinars or to register for future webinars, go to the Docketing Excellence Series tab of the Black Hills IP website, which is www.blackhillsip.com. The webinar that we are presenting today is the 17th one in our overall series and the second of 3 webinars on the topic of best practices for efficient docketing of routine formalities. We will allow time for questions at the end of the webinar. Questions may be submitted using the question button on the right-hand side of your browser window. You can submit a question at any time during the presentation. The question will be held in a queue until the end of the presentation. Before we begin, I want to let people know that Black Hills IP is presenting a free full-day docketing seminar in Chicago on September 7th and in Washington, D.C. on November 8th. The content of the seminars is different than the content of the webinars, so if you've listened to our full webinar series, the seminars will not be a repeat of our webinars. The seminars are interactive workshops with something to offer even for experienced docketers. To register for one of the seminars, go to the Docketing Excellence Series tab of the Black Hills IP website. The presenters for today's program are myself, Chris, and Sasha. I'm Ann McCracken, the president of Black Hills IP. I'm a patent attorney with 20 years experience in patent prosecution. I was a partner at the Schwegman firm for 10 years, and I also was a full-time law professor and directed the patent prosecution program at Franklin Pierce Law Center for 5 years. Chris, can you introduce yourself?
Yeah, thank you. Hi, I'm Chris. I am currently a foreign filing paralegal at Schwegman. I have been at Schwegman for almost 10 years and have been a U.S. paralegal, a foreign case manager, and also worked in the docketing department.
Thank you, Chris. And Sasha, can you introduce yourself?
Yes, thank you, Ann. My name is Sasha. I have been with Schwegman for almost 6 years. I am also a foreign filing paralegal. Prior to that, I was a foreign case management representative and a U.S. case management representative at SLW.
Well, Chris and Sasha, thank you very much for taking your time to present today and talk on this topic. I really appreciate it.
Sure.
Today we're going to be talking about the foreign docketing formalities requirements for 6 different countries. We'll be covering Brazil, Malaysia, Taiwan, Mexico, India, Russia, and Eurasia. During our first webinar on this topic, we talked about why it is such a challenge to docket formalities, and in particular to how to docket foreign formalities and the challenges associated with those. For example, foreign agents often send a request for certain formalities prior to filing the application. At that point, though, if they're docketed based on a filing date, your docketing department doesn't have the filing date to actually docket the deadline. So a common scenario is an agent letter acknowledging the instructions to file may be sent out that mentions that the formalities deadline is 3 months from the filing date, but the application hasn't been filed yet, so at that point you can't docket the deadline. Then, when that same agent reports out the filing of the application, Oftentimes that report out letter makes no mention of the formalities documents that are required because they've already mentioned that in their previous letter. But then there's nothing to trigger the docketing department to docket that formalities deadline now that they have the report out letter that has a filing date. So you get into a difficult scenario where sometimes nothing gets docketed. So that's one example of why it's a challenge. Another is just the fact that the requirements and the deadlines vary from country to country, as you'll see in this program and if you attended the first one. And then we have one more. So we're going to go through about 20 countries total and what the foreign filing formality requirements are. And as I noted, they vary quite a bit. Some countries have deadlines based on the date of filing. Others have deadlines based on a date that the Patent Office requests something, and lots of different ways that these are handled. On top of that, the foreign agent communications are sometimes very unclear. For example, as we were preparing for this particular webinar, we were working on the slides for Brazil, and we had consulted 2 different foreign agents on formality requirements. One of them said the certified copy of the priority document was due in 60 days. Another said it was due in 180 days. And neither one had a reason as to why it was different from the other. It turned out that one of those was telling us an internal deadline, not the actual Patent Office deadline, but they didn't explain that in their letter. Their letter came across as 60-day deadline was the Patent Office deadline. So the bottom line is there's a lot of room for error. There's a lot of room for confusion. And the more you understand, the better you understand the requirements for the individual countries that you're frequently docketing formality deadlines in, the less likely you are to have a serious docketing error. And as we'll discuss in this program, the consequences of missing a deadline for formalities in some countries can be pretty harsh. So, Sasha, can you get us started by talking about Brazil?
Sure, thanks. For all the countries that we are presenting today, with the exception of Taiwan, a certified copy of the priority document is not required when the application is filed as a PCT national phase filing. However, when it is a Paris Convention filing, a certified copy of the priority document may be needed. We will discuss this for each country as we go. In this case, for Brazil, the certified copy of the priority document is due 180 days from the filing date. If it is in English, no translation is needed. A power of attorney is also required. This can be either general or a specific power of attorney. You can file a scanned copy, but the foreign agent will need the original copy in case the Brazilian Patent Office issues any queries. The really important thing for docketers to know about POAs in Brazil is that the deadline of 60 days from filing is a non-extendable deadline. If you miss this deadline, the application will be abandoned.
You know, Sasha, this is one of the deadlines that I think is particularly harsh. As a patent attorney, I would not have expected that failure to submit my power of attorney by that 60-day deadline would cause my application in Brazil to be abandoned. So it is particularly important that that deadline is docketed correctly and it's docketed as a non-extendable deadline because the consequences on this one are pretty harsh.
Yes, it is. An assignment is also due 60 days from the filing deadline. This is a non-extendable deadline and can be met by filing a scanned copy of the assignment. The application must be translated into Portuguese within 2 months of the filing date, and any changes made after the PCT publication can be handled by submitting the IB 306 form.
Okay, thank you, Sasha. Sure. Chris, now let's talk about Mexico.
Okay, thanks. Well, first, when you file in Mexico, you will only need a certified copy of the priority document when it is a Paris Convention filing. That means for PCT national phase applications, you don't have to worry about this requirement. But again, if it's a Paris Convention filing, you must translate the application into Spanish, and it must be done within 3 months from the Mexican filing date. It is really important to have the deadline for filing a translation docketed because it is a non-extendable deadline. Second, powers of attorney may be requested by the Mexican Patent Office. When it is requested, it can either be a general power of attorney or a specific power of attorney. This is due 2 months from the date the power of attorney is requested from the Mexican Patent Office. It can be docketed as an extendable deadline because a 2-month extension is available. Also, make sure you allow enough time to provide the original document for filing. Sasha, I thought you had said you had some other observations in Mexico you wanted to mention.
Right. When the foreign associate is letting you know the deadline for the power of attorney, they will send you a notification from the Mexican Patent Office letting you know the deadline that the power of attorney is due. And sometimes the foreign associate will call that document or notification an office action. So just don't get confused that it's not an office action like you would normally think of, but just the Patent Office saying that an action is due, that the power of attorney deadline has been set.
Good point.
Well, that's a great comment, because another reason formalities can be difficult to document is sometimes the terminology is confusing.
Right.
And as docketers, normally you're thinking about an office action as something that's dealing with the claims and the formal examination has begun. But in this case, you're saying the office action term might be used by your foreign agents for a document that's really just requiring a formality, in this case, power of attorney. Good comment. Thank you.
Right.
Yes. So the next, assignment requirements are similar to POA requirements in Mexico in that they are only required when the Mexican Patent Office requests them, and they have a 2-month deadline, which is also extendable by 2 months. However, what is different about assignments in Mexico is the requirement to have the assignment apostilled. What it means to have the assignment apostilled is, assuming the notary is in the state of Minnesota, you would send the document to the Secretary of State of Minnesota for them to attach a document authorizing that the notary is an actual notary of that state. And that usually takes about 1 to 2 weeks, so keep that in mind. And then lastly, the Spanish translation of the application must be filed within 2 months from filing. This is another important deadline to have on the docket so it doesn't get missed.
So this apostille requirement is something that not a lot of countries have, but when they do have it, you obviously have to allow some additional time because you have to go and get something from the Secretary of State for the particular state that's involved, right?
Correct.
And it sounds like what the Secretary of State is doing is just verifying that the notary stamp is a valid notary, that it's somebody who's currently authorized as a notary in the state, right? So, boy, that's a whole nother level of things you have to worry about here. Again, formalities are complicated.
Yeah.
All right, how about Malaysia? Sasha, can you talk about Malaysia?
Okay. First, certified copies of priority documents are only required if they are requested by the Malaysian Patent Office. I have filed about 5 applications in Malaysia so far this year, and none of them have had requests for certified copies of priority documents. But if you do receive these requests, you need to docket a 3-month deadline. This deadline is extendable by up to 6 months. If the priority document is in English, it does not need to be translated. On the other hand, powers of attorney, or what they call a Form 17, will always be required. The deadline that you need to docket is 3 months from the mailing date of the Preliminary Examination Adverse Formalities Report. This is just a notification from the Malaysian Patent Office. This deadline is also extendable by up to 6 months. I just want to note that the power of attorney document is referred to as a Form 17, and the Malaysian agent will provide you with the form. There is no requirement or deadline for filing an assignment. As long as the application is filed in English, a translation is not required. Just like some of the other countries we've talked about, any changes made to the PCT application after publication can be made by submitting the IB 306 form. Overall, Malaysia is pretty easy to docket for regarding formalities. It is just learning what they call their documents or requirements.
Sure, that preliminary examination adverse formalities report, that's quite a name.
It's a mouthful.
All right. Oops, I jumped ahead. Sorry about that. Chris, can you talk about India?
Yes. So similar to Malaysia, which we just discussed, certified copies of priority documents are not required unless requested by the Indian Patent Office. I rarely see requests for certified copies of priority documents in India, but most of my filings are PCT national phase applications, so most likely they're getting that from the PCT filing. If you do receive a request, you need to docket a 3-month deadline. The deadline is extendable by 1 month. Also, I want to mention that it is really important to review the first examiner's reports. I've noticed on a few of my cases that it is being requested for in their report, so keep that in mind. If you're running short on time, you can submit a scanned copy, but you will have to submit the original copy within 15 days from you submitting the scanned copy. Powers of attorney are required in India. Associates refer to them as the Form 26. These are docketed 3 months from the filing date and are extendable by 1 month. It is important to note that the original copy must be filed. Assignments have a little more time to file. These should be docketed for 6 months from the filing date and are extendable by 1 month. A copy of the assignment can be filed, but it must be notarized. Translation, as long as the application is filed in English, no translation is needed. Something unusual about India is the Form 3 submission. India requires that a list of all counterpart applications filed in other countries be submitted 6 months from the filing date. If any additional applications are filed after that, they also need to be submitted within 6 months from the application filing date.
So, Chris, do you also have to notify the Indian Patent Office about status changes like publication or grant of the application, or is it just filings?
At SLW, we do notify the Indian agent about publication and grant details. I'm not sure if it's a requirement. I would recommend double checking with your Indian associate on that, just to be sure.
Okay. Well, and then to follow on that, for the subsequent application filings, the counterpart applications, I'm just curious how you docket something in the future, right? So you know you have to notify the Patent Office within 6 months of the filing of a counterpart application, but if that's a later filed divisional application, for example, something in the future, how do you go about tracking that deadline?
At SLW, our practice is to keep an open deadline. So once we complete this first corresponding applications, or the Form 3, once we submit that, another one will launch and with a 6-month deadline. So then in 6 months, we go back. It's up to the paralegal to go back and search that. And if there are any updates, to send an updated Form 3 to the associate.
Okay, so you just keep a 6-month, every 6 months there's an item on your docket to check for corresponding applications.
Yes.
And there may or may not have been any filed,
right,
but you check, and even if there's not, then that gets basically redocketed for another 6 months out?
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, it's good to have that activity open because your foreign associates might not remind you of this requirement.
Very good comment. Yes, true.
So it's good to have a system in place for tracking your deadline.
Okay. All right. Sasha, let's talk about Taiwan next. And before you go into Taiwan, though, I just want to remind our audience that Taiwan is not a member of the PCT. The other countries and regional patent offices that we're talking about today are all members of the PCT, but Taiwan is not. And in fact, just as a interesting fact, it's also not a member of the Paris Convention. Very few countries are not members of either of those, but Taiwan is not. So, Sasha, let's talk about formality requirements in Taiwan.
Okay. Unlike the last two countries we just discussed, in Taiwan you are always going to have to provide a certified copy of the priority document. The deadline to docket is 16 months from the earliest priority date, unless it is a design application, in which case the deadline is 10 months from the earliest priority date. The good news is that you don't have to provide a Chinese translation of the priority document. The bad news is that the deadline to submit is not extendable. You have to submit either a hard copy of the priority document or a CD-ROM. A power of attorney is also required, either a general POA or a specific POA. This is docketed 4 months from the Taiwan filing date and is extendable by 2 months. The original copy is not required. Assignments are not required in Taiwan. A Chinese translation of the application is required. This is docketed 4 months from the notification from the Patent Office. And like Anne said before I started talking about Taiwan, just to remind you that Taiwan is not part of the PCT, and as a result, you can't use the IB 306 form to submit any changes.
Good point, Sasha. The last two places we have on our list are Eurasia and Russia. If you're not familiar with Eurasia, Eurasia is one of the regional patent offices, similar to the EPO in that sense, and you can file in Eurasia through the PCT. So you can go into Eurasia similar to the way you'd go into the EPO at the end of the PCT process. If you're curious, the states for which a patent can be obtained through the Eurasian Patent Office include, and I hope I pronounce these correctly, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Belarus, Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, the Russian Federation, Tajikistan, and Turkmenistan. I should get an award for that.
Yeah, thank you for saying those.
All right, I'll turn it back to you, Chris, to talk about the requirements in those two countries, and I think you're going to do them together, but where they differ, you'll point that out to us, right?
Exactly. So for certified copies of the priority document, when it is a Paris Convention filing, is when priority documents are needed. This means for PCT national phase applications, you don't need to worry about the requirement. But if it is a Paris Convention filing, you must file the certified copy of the priority document within 3 months from the filing date or 16 months from the priority date. The date is extendable. Generally, a translation of the priority document is not required, but may be requested by one of the patent offices. Next, power of attorneys are not required unless they are requested by the Russian Patent Office or the Eurasian Patent Office. If it is requested, then what you want to docket for a Russian application is different than what you docket for a Eurasian application. POA for a Russia application is due 3 months from the notification, and in Eurasia, it's 4 months from the date of the notification. The deadline is extendable and scanned copies can be submitted. So that's good news. There is no deadline to file an assignment, but if you do file one, it does have to be the original copy. A notarized copy of the document can be submitted, and the document must have both parties' signatures. Next, the translation, both for Russia and Eurasia filings require that the translation of an application be filed, and that needs to be docketed for 2 months from the filing date. And then, like most of the other countries, any other changes can be submitted with the IB 306 form.
Okay, good. Well, today we've talked about the specific formality requirements for Brazil, Malaysia, Taiwan, Mexico, India, Russia, and Eurasia. And Eurasia might seem like an odd one to have made it onto our list, but it's certainly not as common as the EPO by any means, but I think there are people filing through the Eurasian Patent Office more frequently than certainly they used to. Mm-hmm. And so we wanted to include that one because it is becoming more common, although you may not be familiar with it, so I wanted to make sure we covered that one. In the next program, we plan to cover Singapore, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, China, and EP, and the validation countries for EP. So if you have questions on today's program, please submit your questions using the Q&A button on the control bar on your screen. If you have questions about Black Hills IP services or our processes, please contact our Vice President of Sales, Jim Brophy. His contact information is on the screen for you. And we will be posting the slides and the audio from today's program on our website, blackhillsip.com, under the Docketing Excellence Series tab. And I'm just checking to see if we have any questions at this point. Looks like we just have a comment, which I'll share because it goes to the point that I was trying to make earlier. Somebody noted that they were advised by their Mexican associate of a particular deadline for a power of attorney, and the date that they were advised was different than what we were presenting, but then on further thought, they think maybe this was also an internal deadline like what we had mentioned. And so that just goes akin to my observation that it's really hard to know when these things are due for many reasons, and one is the communications might not always be clear from your foreign agent. Yeah. One of my tips for that for our audience is, if you want your foreign agent to tell you the actual due date, be clear in your letter to them when you're sending the instructions for filing. In your order letters to them, ask them to give you both the initial patent office deadline and then the deadline with extensions. The more specific you are with them, hopefully, the better response you will get, or the clearer response you will get to help with docketing these deadlines correctly. Let me keep going. So our next webinar with those that last list of countries that I read off will be on August 2nd at 1 p.m. Central Time. And after that, we have another webinar scheduled for August 16th, which will be focused on docketing response dates in countries that have acceptance deadlines. So how do you docket the due date for responding when it's a country that operates under an acceptance period, such as Australia? We'll have a whole webinar focused on that. And we're going to be announcing several more webinars very soon. We're creating the list of the next topics right now and plan to have one webinar per month going forward for probably at least the next year is what I'm trying to lay out. So let me just double check the question queue one more time. Let's see. Are you guys? Okay, so I'm looking at one here about Mexico. We have, oops, hang on, it just scrolled off my screen. If we did not get the assignment notarized, only certified by the USPTO, will this affect the apostille requirement? I.e., can we still get an apostille under our Secretary of State if it wasn't notarized? That's a very good question.
That is a very good question. I wouldn't think so because it's not notarized, and the apostille, it's basically certifying that the document is notarized by a legal notary.
Yeah, sorry. Notary, right?
Yeah. So I would think that wouldn't apply. And they were specific to just say that a notarized apostilled assignment was accepted.
Yeah, I agree with you on that, and I think it would be a good question to ask your agent, but I don't see why you would need to go to the Secretary of State if there was no notary to be verified.
Mm-hmm.
So I agree with that. Okay, other than Taiwan, if all are filed, here's the next question. Other than Taiwan, if all are filed ECT, is the filing date the international filing date or the national phase entry date? Well, most of the ones, that's a good question on terminology, and most of the things in the examples we just went through, I believe were 60 days from filing date, 3 months from filing date. So that would have to be the local filing date that we're referring to, and thank you for asking us to clarify. These are coming in. We have a very small window to look at the questions in, and they're scrolling faster than I can keep up with these. Hang on. Okay, here's a really good one. What system do you use for docketing, and is there a docketing system that would automatically docket all of these specific dates for each country? You know, the level of country law that is built into every docketing system really varies from system to system. And at Black Hills IP, we work in at least half a dozen different docketing systems every day. And again, from what my experience is in those systems is some countries have more detailed formality rules built in than others, and it really, really varies. And that's, again, where I think having the knowledge yourself is a big asset, so you can make sure that it's not just a gap in the country law in the system that you're working in. Yeah. That knowledge is really important. Previous Mexican agent did not require the assignment to be authenticated by apostille. Then we switched agents, and now we get an apostille. Any idea if there is a rule change or why there is a difference between agents? Boy, that's a good question.
That's a great question.
I don't know. I don't have an answer to that.
Yeah, I don't either.
It's been my experience in the last 4 years that I've been in foreign filing that an apostille is always needed for Mexico. So I've had several different agents, and that's just always what we've had to do.
So that's the experience of both of you, right?
Yeah.
And when we prepared for this webinar, we also reached out to multiple agents in each country, and again, it was an experience because we compared their answers, and sometimes they were unclear, but we worked through all of that, and that's what we were being told by the Mexican agents that we reached out to as well. So maybe there was, we'll give them the benefit of the doubt, maybe there was a rule change.
Yeah.
Or maybe you're better off with your new agent.
Yeah.
I think, and I apologize if I missed any questions here, I have a new system that we're working through, and it's a little hard for me to track all the questions in here, but I think we've answered all the questions. If there's any that we missed, please follow up with us, and we'll be happy to follow up with you offline. Thank you very much for participating today. We hope you will join us for one of these additional upcoming webinars on the 2nd of August for formalities, or the 16th of August for response dates in countries with acceptance deadlines. And like I said, we hope you'll join us for one of those. And also, if you're not part of our LinkedIn Docketing Excellence group, that you sign up for that as well, because we put additional content out through that group also. Thank you very much.